Hello, Chiara. Thank you for taking the time to join me today.
Thank you for inviting me.
At Net Zero Compare, our audience includes professionals from industry, policy, and consultancy who work directly with the energy transition. In your role as a PhD candidate at the Hertie School and previously as a renewable energy consultant at Enervis Energy Advisors, you work at the intersection of machine learning, data analytics, and market design in Europe. That combination is becoming increasingly important as energy systems grow more complex. So my goal today is to understand how you see current market design challenges, how data-driven approaches support better decision making, and what this means for practitioners navigating these shifts. So let's dive in. Could you walk us through your path from studying economics and computer science to your work in renewable energy consultancy at, for instance, enervis, and now into your PhD focusing on machine learning applied to European energy market data?
Yeah, so see, my motivation has always been fairly simple. I wanted to use data to lead a sustainable transition. Um, and as a kid, I grew up close to the Alps, so I experienced climate change firsthand in a way. And I knew I wanted to do something, but I also was very passionate about maths and technical subjects, and I wanted to find a way to to bring together these two interests in sustainability and maths. And so during my master, I actually, which was in applied mathematics, I had a chance to work at a major energy utility here in Germany. And this is how I realized that the energy sector is actually a great sector if one wants to do something in sustainability and wants to work with numbers. And then after my master, I actually moved to renewable consultancy, which is very interesting for me because it was also the first time that I could hands-on experience how renewable projects are started, how the profitability analysis are done, and so on. And eventually, I moved back to academia because I had the feeling that I wanted to build my methodological set of skills, and one doesn't have the time when you're working from project to project. And that's why I started working on machine learning for energy markets.
Very interesting. And if you could tell us what initially motivated you to focus on research on applying machine learning and time series data from grid operators, and as it is phrased in the research, to identify bottlenecks in the renewable energy transition.
Yeah, so I was already working with a lot of data previously. As I mentioned, I was working in an energy utility, and then I was working in consultancy. Particularly, we were working with we were constructing a large data set of pipeline solar project. But however, I never had the time to actually analyze this data in depth, because it was mostly like some key performances or key insights out of the data, statistical analysis, but I never had the time to actually like build larger, more complex data out of models out of it. So that's what motivate me to then move to research and particularly apply to for this current research project I'm working on, which is broadly speaking, trying to look at like energy data and what the energy data tell us about how power plants are operated in Europe, and how power plants are operated in a way that may favor or not favor the renewable transition. And I can also talk about the project a little bit more later.
Okay. And what we've observed, a lot of practitioners, at least nowadays, feel those bottlenecks daily. So connecting them with real data is extremely useful, just like in your research. And now I would like to focus on techno-economic factors. You have worked on extracting techno-economic parameters from operational generation data. So if you could tell us what kinds of blind spots or modeling limitations in European markets does this approach help reveal?
Yeah, so the idea of this project was we were working with time series of large generation units, so above 100 megawatt. on the European market. We took as a study case 49 power plants from gas power plants from German markets, and what we were interested in at studying was their flexibility, because as you know, in a system with a lot of renewables, you actually don't want gas power plants to operate at a flat generation curve and provide baseload generation, but only cover the time periods where there's peak demand and not enough renewables. And so you would want to, or you would expect to see gas power plants to operate as peakers. But my biggest take from this project was, well, we took those time series of generation of these power plants over long part-time periods. So we're talking about 5 years of hourly data. Then we developed this approach that builds on deep clustering, which is essentially in our case, was a multi-step procedure where we first construct a predictive model to predict the generation of these gas power plants, and then created some embeddings, which are some low-dimensional representation of this time series, and then used the embeddings themselves to compare between units. And what we ended up having or finding was 4 cluster, but actually 2 main distinctions. And what was very striking to me is that around about 50% of the units that we analyzed are not particularly flexible or are not as flexible as we would expect. For example, something that we saw, and I think is very relevant for what we're experiencing in the market today, is that a lot of these power plants, like half of the sample, were very often generating also at times where prices were negative or residual load was particularly low. So that made us understand that we probably models that we're using these days are overestimating how often conventional power plants are going to be operated in a flexible way. They also have some interest in not to operate flexibly sometimes.
And if I understand correctly, physical constraints do not often appear in traditional models, right? So that was a novelty.
I mean, the novelty of our approach was more than the fact that there are some constraints which are sort of baked in the characteristic of the power plants. But then there are also empirical constraints that are very hard to capture in a model. For something like, for example, if you have specific maintenance agreements with turbine operators, you might be discouraged to operate flexibly because it reduces the lifespan of a turbine. Or you might have other types of agreements, for example, agreements with, I don't know, if you're a local municipal utility, you're going to actually provide predominantly service to your local community. All of these constraints are really hard to incorporate to models because they are not publicly available. So I like to think about it as if you think a car, for example, you might have a fast car and a slow car, and you might have a Ferrari and you might have say a Fiat or whatever, and they have different technical capabilities. But then it might also be that you're driving a Ferrari in the city center of Paris, which you're also not supposed to do, and then even if the technical capabilities is much larger, you have a wider range of speed that you can actually get in terms of flexibility, you might have unobserved factors that lead the power plant to actually being operated to a much less flexibly, much lower
Got
flexibility
it.
level. Yeah.
And now I'd like to switch to market power detection because you have co authored research on detecting market power behavior in electricity markets. So, if you could tell us how can data and machine learning realistically support regulators or system operators in this area?
Yeah, so first of all, something that I want to make clear is that market power is an obstacle to energy transition, and the way I like to think about it is the famous notorious energy transition trilemma, which is I like to think about as the acronym AS for affordable, sustainable, and secure, right? And so if the A is very important, which is the affordable part. And market power essentially means that large generation companies actually have significant ability in specific hours to influence prices. And obviously, regulators cannot get rid fully of market power, and that's also not their mission, but they want to have a workable market power. So they want to have prices that are still affordable, even in hours where there's, for example, generation scarcity. So what we focused on actually we co-authored several publications on market power and strategic behavior. And here it was very interesting for us to make a comparison between different markets, because, for example, US markets have a standardized way of dealing with high prices in hours of supply scarcity. They have so-called ex-ante mitigation procedures, and that's what we looked at. We looked at how effective these procedures are to actually prevent prices to become too high in specific hours. We also looked at German market and looked at different incentives that companies might have due to their, for example, different hedging strategies that they have to actually not only raise prices but also sometimes lower prices depending on the sort of hedging that they position that they have for that hour. And ultimately also what we looked at, and I think is actually interesting in terms of a modeling perspective, is the role that reinforcement learning can have or can take for to actually learn market power, to actually you can actually construct an agent that has a large portfolio and actually learns to exploit market power in electricity markets. So all of this in the end points to the fact that empirically it can be detected, which was our publication on a German market. In modeling wise, it can actually be route simulated, so it means that it's actually learnable. But it can also be regulated, and that's what we wanted to show with the paper where we looked at the US market. There are a bit possibilities to streamline regulation of market power abuse in wholesale markets.
As I said, there's always a gap between what theory proposes and then what is feasible to implement in practice.
Yes, that's true as well. And also it's especially in Europe, we have the problem that every country comes with a different proposal, and energy market regulation is primarily, but not only, a country matter. And because of that, I think we're a long way to having something like ex-ante mitigation procedure or much stricter mitigation procedure in Europe. But I might be wrong.
That's interesting because I thought it was more centralized. I thought it was already at the European Union level.
There is also ACER, the regulation authority at a European level, but then there are also each country has its own, so to say, energy regulation authority.
Understood. Now let's talk about data availability and its quality. Across both your professional and academic experience, what have been the most common data quality or data availability challenges you've encountered?
So I think, well, first of all, I would say that compared to other sectors, I'd say that still we have a lot of data available in the energy sector. There's a lot of good sources of open source data. For example, in Europe, we have Utility Transparency. In the US, most ISOs, which is independent system operators, publish almost all of their data. They're ready to available online. So availability, I wouldn't say is the biggest concern, but definitely a problem that we are having is that there are no universally applied standards on how to publish this data. And this leads to the fact that, for example, if I want to match a power plant on 3 different data sets, it probably will have 3 different names. And it probably will have 2 or 3 different IDs, which makes it very hard to match it, but maybe with some heuristic, unless I have the exact coordinate data of those power plants. And obviously the problems get larger and larger as we have more granular data on, for example, solar farms. And those are really hard to match if you start naming them without a convention. So I'd say more than data availability is really data quality and data in having quality standards.
I got it. This is the first time that somebody was not complaining about the data availability when I talked to them.
I mean, you can always have better and more available data. I definitely agree with you. But I think that there's, for example, in Germany, there's a specific example of the so-called Marktstammdatenregister, where every power plant is actually required to be registered, with the result that, unfortunately, that a lot of like public people that maybe have a small solar power plant, like panel in their apartment or on their roof, then register this power plant, which is per se nice, but there's not really a standard on how they're gonna name it, or maybe they don't want to put the location, which is understandable as well. So there's a lot of room for human mistake in the registration process, leading to a very large data set that it may not be very clean and usable in the end.
Now let's talk about what models are made for. So forecasting.
Mhm.
Given the limitations you observed in data and modeling, what should practitioners keep in mind when interpreting analytical outputs so that they do not overstate certainty or, let's say, overlook structural constraints?
Yeah. I think this is a very fair point, and I think we keep on forgetting it when just taking out outcomes of a model. But then there are two key important things to keep in the back of our head, and the first one is that a model is always a product of its assumptions. So, for example, if you're modeling, say, power plant behavior on the market, and you implicitly assume that they're acting rationally, but maybe they aren't, or maybe you have a predictive prediction model and you assume that, I don't know, there's no correlation between wind in Poland and wind in Germany, but there is. This obviously has some consequences for the results that you're going to have. And another thing that I see a lot, I think there is some more understanding on that, but that's something that is important when modeling is, again, these correlations are not causation. So the fact that maybe like your model predictions correlate with like some input variable, for example, does not mean that they are caused by it. And I think this is a separate but like parallel issue that needs to be addressed when interpreting data correlations, the statistical correlations between data, or when interpreting model outcomes.
And are those models usually focusing on price forecasting, or there are also other types of forecasting that they are meant to do?
I mean, I can't really speak for the whole research community, and I myself do not necessarily specialize on forecasting method because I look more at like um different type of like analysis of data with like modeling, for example, this deep clustering approach. So I would say that there are definitely different types of models. I'd say that forecasting methods have come a long way, and still the most focused, the most researched item is price, of course, because it sets so many market signals. But there are also different approaches on how to forecast price, and these have changed a lot with the advent of machine learning, for example.
In your recent analysis of grid and market data, is there any specific bottleneck or inflexibility that you believe remains under discussed?
I gave myself some time to think about it, and I couldn't come up with anything specific. Um, I think in general, something that we should look more into is the role of connectivity constraints. So in Europe, we have a market which is separated from the grid, but then we are interconnected between different countries. Something that I think would be very interesting to research at, and there is a lot of growing research evidence of literature on transmission between different countries and the role that transmission between different countries can have in supporting or not supporting the renewable transition Europe-wide, right? And also of the side effects of the transition. For example, Norway, which all of a sudden has much higher prices than they used to, and what that in turn does to acceptance of the renewable transition in countries that maybe were already much greener and now all of a sudden have much higher prices because of the interconnectivity with other European countries.
Thank you
Yeah.
very much for that example. I was just about to ask if maybe you could give us any example when the research is translated into a real project. Now I'd like to talk about machine learning versus traditional modeling. As electrification and variable renewables expand, where do you see machine learning adding real value compared with traditional modeling approaches, and where do you see clear limits?
Yeah. So first of all, there's this principle in science, which is the Occam's razor, which I'm not familiar with, but it simply says that like if there are two models and one is more complex and the other one is less complex, always go for the less complex model. So I would say you don't need machine learning for anything. Where machine learning is very good at is forecasting. So machine learning is gradually substituting traditional statistic in forecasting. Although there are other interesting hybrid approaches, but I would say that it's sort of standard practice now to do predictions with machine learning. But there are other domains where machine learning is not a preferred option, and for good reasons. For example, optimal dispatch planning. So market clearing, essentially, when you have grid constraints, or also long-term capacity expansions. All of these problems are numerical optimization problems, and they are still solved as numerical optimization problems. And there's actually, to this moment, not really a need to substitute them with machine learning, although machine learning can be a good companion in the sense that for example, machine learning can be used to warm start the solution of numerical optimization model. What that means is that you still will use a numerical optimization model, but you will start with the solution, with the approximate solution of a machine learning prediction. And finally, something that I think has a lot of potential where machine learning can be used is in simulation and control environments where you can actually use reinforcement learning. Something that it could be very valuable if you have some sort of prosumer or EV, and the EV and you want to determine the optimal charging times for your EV. I think reinforcement learning there can definitely help. Although I still believe that because the electrical city system is um such a critical infrastructure, it's still very important to have some safety rules in place before actually using, like, I don't know, fully automated algorithms for very critical actions on electricity grids.
Thank you very much for clarifying that, especially since machine learning probably, as you know, often gets overstated in energy discussions as the top priority and the best solution in modeling.
Yeah, and I also think that people make a little bit un an undifferentiated utilization of the word machine learning, where there are a lot of different things that can be machine learning, right? So I definitely think that machine learning makes sense in specific, for example, for forecasting. If you understand the inputs that might lead to a good forecast, then there's no need for you to use a regression. You can definitely use machine learning. But then it's a different thing than thinking that machine learning is everything in machine learning is LLMs, which is obviously not the case.
Exactly. From a from a market design perspective, what improvements in transparency, data access, or market rules would most effectively support the energy transition in your view?
Yeah, I think that the conversation that I've experienced, at least mostly from like being an informed a person in the in an energy sphere, something that I realize is that very often the conversation gets very dogmatic. And I would actually argue that maybe a moralistic approach and less a dogmatic approach would be helpful in moving towards system with higher share of renewables. And for a concrete example, I think we've always witnessed it with the European taxonomy debate, right? Where we had Germany very strongly advocating for gas, and we had France very strongly advocated for nuclear. And now I absolutely think that it's a fair question to ask. Okay, what will do we do when there's no renewables? Do we build more battery? Do we build demand flexibility? Do we need some backup conventional generation and so on and so forth? But what I do not think makes sense is just saying, okay, we will build no more nuclear or we'll just build more gas. Not because it doesn't make sense per se, but because the conditions and the needs of different countries might be different, and that doesn't make sense to stick with one technology as we move in the transition. It will require a lot of modeling, a lot of data analysis, and a lot of really just less dogmatic approaches, and let us really guide from what the scientific evidence is.
Now, looking into the future, looking ahead, which analytical skills or research areas do you think will matter most for the next generation of energy market professionals?
I think that a broader understanding of the field is important. Traditionally, I think the energy sector has been very much dominated by engineers. And also, for example, in research, it was like a PhD in engineering, then someone was doing maybe PhD in economics. Maybe the two different fields would not really speak to each other, so that the PhD engineer would just solely think about how to make power plant or turbine work, and the economist just about how to make the market work. But I think that what we will need in the future is really just a broader understanding of energy sector.
Our audience includes many analysts and consultants, so this practical guidance will be very valuable. Thank you for that. And before we wrap up, is there anything important we have not covered? Anything you would like to add that could be particularly relevant for our audience? And also, please feel free to share more about your engagement in the Strommarkttreffen network, since its role in bringing experts together is quite important in this field.
Yeah, so that's thank you. Thank you for your questions, and I think that Strommarkttreffen, it's a very German name, which only means energy network. And it brings me back to the point, which I also think is another very important and relevant skill, which is meaningful networking. So not just actual meaningful connections in the sector you're moving in are super valuable. And as member of the research community, but also someone that likes to connect with energy professionals, I'm part of the Strommarkttreffen network. What we do is it's both a newsletter where it's a decentralized newsletter where people can actually share insights, events, studies, conferences, and jobs with more, I would say, focus on the German speaking area. And we also organize monthly meetings where we discuss topics that are relevant for the energy transition. So, for example, on the 17th of April, we're actually going to discuss batteries. So all of this is part of my personal engagement. I do it besides my PhD, but it's very important for me because I get to speak with people from the industry. I get to speak from people from energy regulators. I get to speak with other academics, and I would definitely encourage anybody that has the capacity to do so to actually engage in this sort of networks.
And of course, we encourage everyone. I like this last question because it often brings out insights we did not even know we are missing. Chiara, thank you for taking the time to share your insights today. It has been a valuable discussion, and I am sure our audience will appreciate the clarity you brought to these topics.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. It was nice to talk to you.
My pleasure.